Morning everyone, and a very warm welcome to the third meeting of the Education Skills Committee in 2020. Can I remind everyone to turn mobile phones off or to silent so that they don't disturb the meeting today. First agenda item is a decision on taking our discussion today in private. Are members content to do that in private? Thank you. Agenda item 2 is our evidence session on... Okay, sorry, I've omitted to say that we also wish to take the work programme in private at committee's next meeting. Are members content to do that? Thank you. Agenda item 2 is our evidence session on counsellors in school education. And can I welcome to committee this morning Laura Meikle, Unit Head Support and Wellbeing Unit at the Scottish Government, Nicola Dickey, Chief Executive Officer Children and Young People at COSLA, Brian McGee, Chief Executive of Counselling and Psychotherapy in Scotland, COSCA, Joanne Holmes, Children, Young People and Families Lead at the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy, BACP, Stella Gibson, Chief Executive of the Spark, Dee Barker-Cregan, Children and Young People's Counsellor at the Spark, and Deborah Gallagher, Head of Guidance and Personal Social Education, representing the Scottish Guidance Association, and Stuart Valentine, Chief Executive of Relationship Scotland. It's going to be a sort of round table this morning, so more an open discussion rather than an evidence session. So we hope people will indicate to the clerks or to myself if you wish to answer a question from the committee, and also from our members as well, if they could let us know. And hopefully we'll have plenty of time to discuss all the issues in front of us. I would like to open by giving each member who's invited today an opportunity to say a little bit about their organisation and highlight, where relevant, what they consider the role is in relation to policy delivery of counselling in Scotland. And I'd like to start with Stella Gibson from the Spark. Thank you.
Okay, so we are the Spark, and we have been providing counselling services across Scotland for over 50 years. We've been providing children and young people services for about the last 12 years as part of our early intervention strategy. For the last just over 3 years, we've been delivering school counselling services at scale, and we're currently working in over 40 schools across the Central Belt, and also with some delivery in Aberdeen. We're quite unique, I think, in terms of being a counselling organisation, because we don't just deliver counselling, we actually also train our counsellors, and we provide supervision. So we provide a whole package of support for schools. So if we've got a counsellor in a school, they don't work in isolation. They're supported by a clinical team, they're supported by their supervisor, and they're supported by their manager. And we think that that's really important, that we don't have counsellors out in schools working in isolation. We deliver a diploma in relational counselling, which is part of our training for children and young people's counsellors, with specialisms in intimate relationships, children and young people's counselling and family counselling. So we can train people to work with couples, to work in schools, and then to further train as counsellors for families, which I think moving forward might be something that we should be doing more of in schools, is supporting families. I think the key issue for us as part of the commitment from the Scottish Government is that we have a concern about the number of counsellors who are available to deliver this policy. And it's not just about the number, it's also the number of quality counsellors. As I say, we're working in 40 schools. We are getting inquiries, 2 or 3 inquiries a week at the moment from individual schools, from clusters, looking for counselling in schools. We've just recruited again for counsellors, so we train counsellors, but because we don't have sufficient counsellors to deliver our children and young people's work, we recruit counsellors to do that. And we got a total of 11 applications, and we took 4 of those counsellors. We could have taken 11 counsellors easily in terms of delivery. So we would say that there's not sufficient quality counsellors out there. Supervision is also something that we feel is very important, and consistency of supervision within the service delivery. When we started out, and we're very open about this, our experience of delivering a counselling service at scale. When we started out delivering our service, we recruited external counsellors into the organisation, and they all had their own supervisors. There was no link between the counsellor, the supervisor and the service delivery. So we felt that that had a real impact on quality. And we actually saw the change in quality when we moved to having our own internal supervisors. So at that point, the supervisors, the clinical supervisors, have a responsibility for the service. So they're not supervising in isolation of the service delivery. So we feel that that's a key point for us. I've got one other point as well, which has just slipped out of my head. What was my other?
Don't worry, I'm sure there'll be plenty of time to come back to it, and I'll let you in with that. I'll move on to Mr Valentine. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, Relationships Scotland have been operating in Scotland for the past 70 years, and we support people with relationship problems and also those who go through separation and divorce. Our services cover the whole of Scotland, so we're up in the Western Isles, the Shetlands, the Orkney, Dumfries and Galloway, and everywhere in between. Each year we see over 19,000 people face to face and deliver over 100,000 support sessions across the country. Now, in terms of our work with children and young people, we do provide some children and young people's counselling across Scotland. So currently we have 22 fully qualified children and young people's counsellors. But we are aware that there's significant capacity within our network. As I say, we've got around 160 counsellors across the whole country, many of whom would be interested in training as children and young people's counsellors. And also, I think it's important to mention that the geographical spread of our services means we could deliver on-the-ground counselling for children right across the country if we can find the way and the resources to have our counsellors trained up to also deliver that work. I think there's a key issue about, as I no doubt we will come to, a key issue about just the capacity of Scotland as a country to have enough qualified children and young people's counsellors. We think it's vital that we focus a lot on the qualifications of counsellors, and that we don't have people undertaking this work who are not properly qualified. All of our counsellors, of course, are properly qualified. I think there's an enormous opportunity just now for this work to take off, but it's very important that it's done in the correct way. We're delighted that COSCA and other professional bodies are involved in this work. We think it's a great opportunity for Scotland and for Scotland's young people, but it's vital that we get it right.
Thank you. Ms Dickey.
Hi, good morning committee, and thanks for the opportunity to be with you all this morning. I don't really have masses to add over and above the letter that COSLA sent on the back of your letter to Councillor McCabe, but I suppose as a membership organisation, COSLA were responsible for, along with Scottish Government, agreeing the aims and principles that will support the counselling across Scotland's schools. So that was agreed politically, and then we will deliver on that through our political structures. So Councillor McCabe, who's the Children and Young People's spokesperson for COSLA, and Councillor Stuart Curry, who's the Health and Social Care spokesperson, will have an overall responsibility from a COSLA perspective, and then local elected members will obviously have arrangements to ensure that those things are delivered locally. As with everything that COSLA enters into, we look to keep as much local flexibility as we possibly can. We recognise that the Orkney Island and Glasgow situation is not the same, so we are always clear that in any aims or principles or anything that we get involved in, that we keep as much local flexibility as we can. We think that's important. It's particularly important because the agenda in and around our schools at the moment is very much around about listening to what our children and young people and their families want in that local area, and it's not about imposing anything. So I think that's our start and end point around about where the aims and the principles come from. We recognise that this is not necessarily straightforward to deliver. There's not many things that we look at in accordance to our children and young people that are, but we are confident that we can deliver on this, and we're really pleased that both COSCA and others have been able to help us on that journey. The timescales are a challenge. That's not unique to school counselling. It's something that local government in Scotland is used to delivering on, but we are confident that we have the right sort of building blocks in place to help us on that journey. We recognise that the funding is always an issue. There was a slight delay in the funding between when we announced the funding and when we actually got that out to our leaders. That doesn't mean that there was no planning going on. I think local authorities are already well versed in an awful lot of this stuff, and some local authorities are indeed already providing school counsellors. And the other thing that I would probably stress before I finish is that we don't see school counsellors in and of themselves as the solution. We see them as part of the solution. So the committee will be aware of the Mental Health Programme Board, which is taking forward other work around about community services, access to CAMS, etc. So I think in terms of school counselling, it is one of a number of things that we have going on for our children and young people. We are also working hard with our teaching workforce and those others who are in the school to make sure that they're in a position to help our young people at the lowest possible level, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms Meikle?
I'm also very grateful for the opportunity to come and share with you the work that we've been doing on counselling through schools. By way of background, counselling through schools is one strand of work as part of a cross-government strategy to improve and strengthen children and young people's access to support for their mental health and well-being. This includes strengthening resources available for school staff to deliver effective learning, as well as wider support across school communities. The cross-government approach in partnership with COSLA seeks to enhance the services available to support children and young people from their early years through to 24 years of age, in order to respond effectively to the concerns that have been highlighted about young people's mental health and well-being, and which have led to the Mental Health Task Force and the Children and Young People's Mental Health and Wellbeing Programme Board. Counselling through schools, which is funded by the Health Department and delivered jointly by Education and Health, provides an opportunity to enhance service provision within young people's communities and to provide targeted and effective access to support. Young people can still access child and adolescent mental health services support if required, but the referral to these services should be more accurate as a result, and there has been concerns about referral to children and adolescent mental health services. In terms of counselling specifically, the framework for provision of counselling is provided by the jointly agreed aims and principles, which include the requirement for counsellors to be registered by an appropriate professional body, that the service should be available to all pupils out with school term time, provided within a framework of local services building upon those already available, aligned to getting it right for every child, and for those primarily in secondary schools but also in other school settings for pupils who are aged 10 and over. Our work on counselling through schools is a partnership approach with COSLA and has been informed by discussions with a wide range of stakeholders, some of whom are here today: BACP, COSCA, the Spark, and evidence from evaluation of approaches to counsellors in other parts of the UK. This hasn't been a straightforward commitment to deliver, and there have and will be challenges, but we are confident that we will be able to deliver on this commitment as part of a broad range of programme for government commitments to better support children and young people's mental health and well-being. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms Holmes?
Thank you. So BACP is a membership organisation. We have about 50,000 members across the 4 nations. And Steve Mulligan, my co-worker, is here today. He's our 4 nations lead, so is present quite often in Scotland. We're a professional standards organisation with an ethical framework that's embedded in working with children and young people within a competency framework. So there's different routes into working with children and young people within the counselling sort of offer. You can't just train as a counsellor and work with children and young people. There's a whole different sort of level of step changes and CPD and training. So one of our concerns would be the level of training, of course, that's available across Scotland to get people, ready to be, competent really to work with children and young people. Picking up on what Stella says, our experience really echoes that in Wales. So the Welsh school-based counselling offer, a government-funded programme, has been in place for pushing towards nearly 10 years. So from 2011, services commission out, so there's no single provider. Different services commission out across the different local authorities, and they've got the protection of working for a service with all of the policies, procedures, safeguards that come with that. And part of what they provide is in-house supervision, so they wouldn't have supervision coming in from different sort of professional providers, regardless of how competent those supervisors would be. So that keeps things in-house, so there's direction of travel, they're working together, and it keeps counselling really boundaried, safe for those young people and children that we're in contact with. the Welsh worries many years ago that there wouldn't be a workforce. It was very, very similar to what the things that we're hearing today, that there wouldn't be a workforce, they wouldn't be ready, and it has been a long process, but they're delivering now in all schools. They're beginning to look at primary schools there in Wales, but they want to get it right. So there's a lot of experience to share from the Welsh, way forward. We've worked very closely, updated a toolkit, which has been a manual really of good practice that again is good to sort of dip into, and we can share some of that learning as well. And just to reiterate as well what Nicola said, school counselling is part of a whole school approach. It's one offer in almost like a mixed bag of services. Triage is really, really important. So it could be the school nurse that somebody goes to. It could be a guidance teacher. It doesn't have to be a school counsellor. School counselling is just appropriate for some young people. It's an early help prevention. And when offered, when it's accessible, easy for young people to refer into, it's a first point of contact. It enables young people to not completely, to repeatedly tell their story again and again and again. So their mental health journey is less chaotic. Some of the learning in Wales, which is really important to share, is it's beginning to have some impact on some of the CAMHS waiting lists. So in an area at Cardigan in West Wales, they're working in collaboration with CAMHS so that the only referrals they put forward are the ones that will meet the threshold. This is mental illness, not mental health. Issues that, psychological distress, etc., that we can work with in schools and community settings. So not always in schools, it may be in a community setting as well. And on top of that, my own personal experience is working as a school counsellor, so anything I can share, I'm really happy to do that.
Thank you. Mr. McGee.
Good morning. COSCA is Scotland's professional body for counselling and psychotherapy. We've been advancing and promoting counselling in Scotland for the last 30 years or so. We're a membership organisation like BACP. We have individual members. We have organisations delivering counselling that are members as well. We validate courses in counselling skills, in supervision, in working with children and young people, and working with adults as counsellors. We also accredit counsellors to give a quality assurance to their work when they've reached that stage. We have a recognition scheme for organisations which quality assures the work that counselling organisations that are members of COSCA do. We very much welcome the announcement and the commitment in the programme for government to create more counselling in schools. 350 new counsellors is the commitment. We very much welcome that. We've been working with Laura and her team since that announcement was made. Some of the issues that are still around, I think, are to do with the workforce, are to do with the training costs, and I'm happy to share how much it costs to do a specialist course in counselling children and young people, and how potentially that could be financially exclusive to many people in Scotland. The research question came up in one of the papers. I wonder if we had time to just pick that up and maybe explore that a bit further about what research is actually done or being done and soon to be done in relation to that. And those are the main things I want to share at this point.
Thank you. Ms Gallagher.
Hello, as a member of the Scottish Guidance Association, I'm here representing guidance professionals working in school. We are a group of volunteers who provide continuing professional development opportunities and seek to inform the national picture when we can too. Today we welcome the plan to introduce counsellors across secondary schools and recognise the ambitious timescale of this project. Our concern has been the provision of mental health support for young people, and we notice a real uptake in the scale and complexity of mental health issues facing young people in schools. We welcome this move as part of a package of support for young people. And as ever, our concern has to do with consistency. We recognise local flexibility and the lack of prescription as a real strength in Scottish education, but we would like to ensure that our young people experience parity of support in the services they access, and concerns regarding financial exclusivity being an issue in the provision of this service is something we'd like to see addressed too. As professionals, we'd like to work in partnership with the people providing services, and we'd like to have some clarity around referral, triaging and confidentiality issues so that we are working together to collaborate and provide the best support for our young people. Thanks.
Thank you. And Miss Barker-Cregan.
Hello. Thank you for having me. I feel really lucky to be here, and I work in 2 local authority schools in Glasgow and North Lanarkshire, and I'm a children and young persons counsellor in the schools. It's actually been lovely to hear some of the things that have been said as well, but I definitely think that what Nicola was saying earlier around a whole school approach, I think it's something about working together, and it's not just, you know, one person at all. So I absolutely agree with that.
Okay, thank you very much. We have questions from the committee members, but we're hoping to make it as free-flowing as possible. So as I said, please indicate if you wish to contribute, and we'll try to get everyone in as much as possible. We're going to open with a question from my colleague Gail Ross.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel, and thank you all for your opening statements. So I just want to start off with the number of counsellors and the ability to recruit, which is coming from a rural area, makes me quite nervous about, you know, how we're going to actually attract these people. It says in the paper that the Scottish Government intends to create around 350 counsellors in school education, and that would be the end goal is 1 per school. We have 357 secondary schools, and we just heard from the Spark that they are working in over 40 schools already. So how are the numbers finalised? Do we actually know how many counsellors we need to recruit? Do we know how many are going to actually still be working, that are already working there? Do we have a final number for what we're actually aiming for?
So the commitment was based on 1 counsellor per school. The number of 350 does recognise that it relates to the number of secondary schools in Scotland, but it isn't exact. So the 350 relates to the 357. When we were looking at how the policy would work, there are a number of schools across Scotland that actually have quite small pupil populations, and so we were looking to balance where there are larger schools, you would have more than 1 counsellor, and in smaller areas you would actually have less than 1, but every school would have access to someone. And so there's a balancing arrangement there, because we don't want under provision, but you also can't have over provision either. So the arrangement at the moment that we have, as you're aware from the papers that we've submitted, is that we are currently in the process of our governance arrangements, which are to draw in plans from authorities on where we are in terms of the planning for the development of the commitment, and therefore we will know how many counsellors we will have. At this moment in time, we are still in that process, and I must complete our governance arrangements internally prior to making that information public, but we would intend to share with the committee in due course information about where we are in terms of those plans, and to give reassurance that we are on track, or indeed if we need to take any mitigating action.
So is that up to the local authority then to determine if a counsellor works between 2 schools, or do they submit the evidence and then you make the decision?
So they make the proposal, and we look to see whether or not it aligns to aims and principles, and do all that. It is a governance arrangement, and at the moment the governance arrangement is focused around planning. We will also require at a later point to look at outcomes and those things, but at the moment we are very much focused on planning and ensuring that we are ready for implementation, and that's essential, given that we are 9 months away from our end point. So it's quite intense. The framework of aims and principles provides the framework within which authorities will make their decisions. The aims and principles are also extremely clear that we are looking for school counselling to be knitted into the local services that are available, a part of that holistic approach. and therefore there has to be local decision making around that in order to enable that to happen. But it has to be within the framework of the aims and principles.
Okay, thank you.
We go on, Gail. Ms Gibson and Mr Valentine wanted to comment, if that's okay.
Say that we're working in over 40 schools at the moment, but the majority of them are actually primary schools. So we've got a counsellor population who are dedicated beyond the commitment. We work in primary schools, and some primary schools we work 1 day a week. We have primary schools where we work 4 days a week. Particularly in Glasgow, there seems to be a very large need. So those counsellors are actually not working as, or going to be working as part of the commitment. We do some work in high schools, but the demand for us has always been in primary schools.
Yeah, just to add, I mean, I think there's a common theme in all the written responses that have come back to the committee is that there aren't enough qualified children and young people's counsellors as it currently stands to fulfil this. I think in Cosca's reply there was a mention of 162 people on their register. Now, not all of those people will be coming forward to do this work. So I think it's quite clear that there needs to be training in the future to train up people to become children, young people's counsellors, but that is not either a quick or a straightforward process. They would need to do a generic diploma in counselling and then do the specialism in children and young people's counselling. So there's a journey for people to go on. And the question is, where will these people come from? I can certainly speak from our network. As I say, we've got 160 counsellors in our network. Within 2 years, in theory, if we had the right support, we could deliver another 40 qualified children and young people's counsellors to this work, and that's something we could bring to the table, but we would have to find the resources and the ability to be able to do that.
Okay, Mr McGee.
What Stuart said there are about 160 student young people counsellors on our student database already. There are 2 courses that we validate that are training people specifically to work with children and young people, one at the University of Strathclyde and one under Crossreach's Tom Allen Centre delivered in Edinburgh. The one at Strathclyde is full and has been full since its inception. It's got a waiting list at the moment. The other one is struggling a bit more, but it's going to have a second cohort being delivered in May this year. Just to touch on the costs for the Strathclyde University course, if a counsellor who's been previously trained to work with adults wants to do that course, it will cost them £2,000. The one delivered at Simpson House will cost £1,600. There's other courses that we validate that are generic core diploma courses which have getting built in an element, a dimension, a component, a module to train people to be counsellors of children and young people. The Sparks course in particular has built that in, so we could see some of that going forward. So there's progression, there's the workforce already trained out there. The BSEP survey also indicates, maybe Joe could talk about that, some willingness on the part of BSEP members to come forward as well. So it's not, we're not starting from scratch, but I think it's going to be a time element in terms of growing this workforce.
It's okay for me to add something. Yes, so we had this is a survey, a workforce survey in 2018, which we had about a 25% response, and 40% of those people that responded said they were currently working with children and young people, and that's from the 4 to 10 and the 11 to 18. So some of those respondents may well have been, working for some of the providers that are working in primary schools, but they certainly indicate that there was a capacity to, retrain for people to have those skills in working with children and young people, and the capacity to increase client hours. So what we don't know with those numbers, if these members were in private practice or working for services and agencies or freelancing in schools or employed by schools, we haven't got that particular breakdown, but certainly there's an appetite for that if the right training is in place.
Okay, Ms Ross.
Yes, thanks. I'm glad you touched on that, because I was going to come to both of you for your evidence that you had sent in. I'm quite interested to hear about the, Joanna, in your evidence, you said that 47% that weren't already working with children and young people would be interested in going along and specialising in that area. Does that not leave gaps, though, in the areas that they're already working in?
Possibly. So they possibly could be delivering private practice hours and working with the adult population, which is very, very different to working with children and young people. So those members might have an interest in working with children and young people. They might not necessarily be the best people for those particular posts, because you've got to have that passion of being able to, to develop those relationships with young people. So there's lots that want to do that, and hopefully with the right training they can do.
Oh, sorry, Brian, would you want to come in?
There is really a surplus of counsellors in Scotland who are trained to work with adults who are not in employment. Each year we have about 200 graduates coming through our system, and there's not 200 new jobs for those graduates every year. So it's the conversion of those trained to work with adults to work with children. Yeah. That's what we're talking about.
That's interesting. Laura?
Alison, did you want to come in?
I think there's a few points here. If we're going to train up new children and young people's counsellors from scratch, one of the challenges will be that they have to do a number of hours in schools working with children and young people. Our course, our diploma at level 11, requires 170 practice hours. Now, they can't go into schools because they don't have membership. So that's a challenge if you're going to train people up from scratch. The cost is another challenge. So as an organisation, we charge for our diploma. It costs over £7,000 to train with us in the diploma. People also have to have done their COSCA certificate in counselling skills, which is another £1,000. So if people are coming to us, they're having to find their own fees. They have to cover their fees themselves. If they go to a university, they may be eligible for SAS. And I think there's a real issue in terms of diversity, in terms of counselling, because you're only really going to get people who can afford to train as counsellors coming to organisations like us. I think it's also very significant. As an organisation, we provide, if we're training somebody up, we're providing them with the training, the supervision, the placement, and then we'll provide them with opportunities for employment. So we provide a whole package. If you're going to, for example, a university, you go to the university, you do your academic qualification, you go out on placement into an organisation, and you get your supervision somewhere else. And I think that there's a disparity there in terms of connection. I think that there's not a sufficient connection to ensure that if we're going to put people in schools, that they're going to be quality and sufficiently qualified, not in terms of the bit of paper, but actually in terms of the quality of the service delivery and the support that's in place. So there's an issue in terms of training costs for organisations like us. I think we're talking about children and young people's counsellors and even training existing counsellors up to be children and young people's counsellors. And there might be lots of existing counsellors who would be interested in working in children. But will they actually want to work in a school environment, which is very different from working in a local centre? In a local centre, it's a very calm place, it's therapeutic. You're going into a school, it's a very different environment. You've got lots of relationships you need to build up within a school if you're going to be successful within that school. And I think finally the whole issue of employment, I think that in Scotland for a lot of years we expected our counsellors to be volunteers. So they'll go away, they'll train, and then we expect them to deliver voluntary hours. We should be taking this seriously and looking at career progression and professional service delivery. And I think we've still got quite a way to go in that respect in Scotland.
Oh, I think Laura might want to come in.
I'll bring in Miss Gallagher and then we'll go to Miss Meikle. Thanks.
I wanted to support what Stella said. We know that recruitment and retention of teaching professionals has been an issue in recent years. And while I'm encouraged to hear the numbers and capacity that may be available in having conversion of counsellors to specialists in young and people in children provision, I do have some concerns about working in the school environment too. We need to know that the staff who would seek to be involved in such a role would be dedicated to it and prepared to work in the school environment that Stella rightly identifies as quite a different experience.
Miss Meikle?
So I think so there are 2 points in summary. In our work around this commitment, we have reassurance to some degree that there is capacity available. And however, that doesn't mean that we have set aside concerns about workforce. And you'll have seen from the submission that was put forward that we have also worked with the SQA in order to be able to ensure that there's an offer of training for those who are already established as counsellors. So there is a specific piece of work around enabling qualification through a new professional development award in counselling children and young people, which is mapped to the professional standards defined by BACP and will be jointly awarded by SQA and BACP, but also that the SQA has developed a new professional development award in counselling supervision. So we have put arrangements in place in order to enable training, and the benefit of working with the SQA is that they are able to deliver those through colleges which are spread right across Scotland, and so we are able to make sure that training is offered in locations not just in the Central Belt and you know, right across Scotland. So we're able to look at supporting provision of counselling in the borders, but also in Highlands and in the islands, and so that was a deliberate decision. There are a number of private providers available who can provide training and support to counsellors, but we need to take a strategic approach in terms of that offer and to put that in place, and we did do that as part of that recognition of some of the challenges that have been outlined.
Will those qualifications be open to SAS applications for people?
They may be. I would have to confirm that.
Okay, it would be helpful if you
can do
get
that,
back to us on that. Thank you. Ms Ross?
Convener, my next question was going to be which of these training courses are available in rural areas, and thanks very much to Laura for preempting that, so thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to a question from Ms Mackay.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I just wanted to probe a bit more about the link with CAMS that school counsellors will have. I mean, I have constituents, I'm sure we all have, who are on an 18-month waiting list for CAMS. So how do you think this is going to impact? Is this going to help to alleviate that waiting list?
The entire approach that the Scottish Government is taking is to provide services across, as I set out, from birth to 24 years old, which is about prevention and early intervention. We have a range of commitments. So the one that we happen to be focusing on today is the school counsellors' commitment, but there is also a commitment to school nursing. There is a commitment to perinatal mental health. There is the further in education counselling service as well, and the development of a community based support service as well, which is around supporting families. All of those together are designed to ensure that we provide an earlier offer in order to help people to get support, which means that they don't have to rely on child and adolescent mental health services. They ask that, you know, the programme across all of the different departments in government who are working on this is about improving that service to try and reduce the reliance on that kind of top line service and to provide earlier and better, more effective support.
What about children who are on that waiting list at the moment, waiting assessment? I mean, how does that fit in with the new initiative?
So I think we've heard this morning that that our timescale is challenging. It is deliberately so because we need to be able to implement school counselling as one of those responses. Therefore, we have to try to move quickly, and it is because at the moment that situation can, you know,
do you have an actual timescale in mind? Do you have
for school counselling? Is the implementation is September 2020.
And how? And do you have a kind of a objective to see how that will impact on the CAMS waiting list?
Yes. So that there are a number of measures that we will look at. We will undertake review. We will look at against a number of factors. CAMS waiting times is one of those, but we would also be looking to look at other outcomes for children and young people. We should expect to see improved attendance at school, improved relationships and behaviour. It should benefit in a number of ways, but we need to establish what I've said earlier. At the moment, we are extremely focused on implementation in September. We will have a review period where we will look at what the outcomes are and monitor those. We haven't had the conversations yet about what those outcome factors will be monitored. We will do that in the intervening period after the implementation has occurred and there's a period of settling in. We will then review that and check that those outcomes are actually where we should be in terms of that benefit to children and young people, which is ultimately what all of it is about.
Thank you. Ms Holmes?
If I could just add, the experience of Wales in some areas where they're working very closely with CAMHS is that it is reducing waiting lists, and that they're talking about the missing middle. So it's the young people that they can see, the children and young people that are just stuck in that middle bit. It's not early help. It's quite psychological distress, but it's not necessarily a CAMHS referral. And to some extent, it almost feels like there needs to be a cultural shift to feel that CAMHS is not the only way, that CAMHS is one service on a pathway, yes, but not the only way, and lots can be, you know, worked with within the counselling setting, and counsellors that work with children and young people are so skilled in with so many different sort of methods and approaches within their portfolio that work best for young people. I was evaluating a service in Gloucestershire, a commission service that's looking at providing school counselling, and I interviewed one young person about 3 weeks ago who'd been on a CAMHS waiting list for about 10 months. So they put in some counselling. It was ongoing counselling. It wasn't just 5 or 6 sessions. I mean, all in all, it was around about 18, I would say. And by the time that the CAMHS referral came and she had her first appointment, she didn't need to go. And this was anecdotal 6 months later. So I interviewed her 6 months after her appointment at CAMHS, which she didn't need because everything had been dealt with within the counselling sort of situation. And that's only one story, but it's one story of many. So it's working with those young people as early as possible, because the distress that comes with waiting and waiting and waiting for something that you might not actually get the service that you're expecting to get. There's no cure, there's no tablet, there's no way to just stop feeling so low, distressed, anxious. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I know Ms Dickey wants to come in, and I've got 3 members who want to supplementaries, so I'll come back to them. Thanks.
Thank you. It was just really to pick up on that wider point about outcomes. So whilst CAMHS wait times are a useful thing for us to be touching against, we are absolutely clear from a local government perspective this is about improving outcomes for children and young people. So we see CAMHS wait times as one of the things that will tell us how we're doing, but we also see the wider evaluation. So how are our young people feeling? How are our teachers who are supporting our young people feeling? How are the families who are dealing with these children and young people? I think it's important that we see this, whilst it is attached to school, it will be firmly anchored within the community. That recognition that our children and young people are at school for a lot of the week, but they're elsewhere for an awful lot of the week. So I think we have to be really careful that we will, and I'm almost sure we will see some sort of change in the CAMHS wait time, but we also there are other measures in there about inappropriate referral, how many referrals are being refused. It's a complicated situation. So I think from a local government perspective, once we have all of the plans and we're able to analyse where we're going, I think we'll be in a situation where we can start to think about what do we do if we're seeing issues in rural areas that we need to plug. What do we need to do if we need to do some support to make sure that other organisations who are not universities and colleges can be involved, but we are not there. And importantly, the Mental Health Programme Board, whilst this was not one of their suggestions, they are looking at this. And again, that's jointly chaired by Scottish Government and COSLA. So whilst this is very specific to school counsellors, we are very much looking at that in the round. And again, that's a kind of whole system way of approaching our children and young people that we're seeing right throughout the school estate at the moment. So I think if we were to try and do this in any other way, it would appear odd, to be quite honest. This seems like the only natural way to do this, bearing in mind the context in which we're operating across the schools.
Okay. Ms Goldruth?
Convener, I'd like to pick up on some of the content we already covered with Deborah Gallagher, specifically on the role of guidance teachers in schools. And, you know, I note that the PSA review looked at, you know, the whole school approach to how we support children across, I guess, their educational experience. And an eighth of the curriculum is already devoted to health and well-being. And I worry there's potentially a danger that we're reinventing the wheel here, and that actually we could potentially undermine the role of guidance staff in school. And I just would be interested in what your views might be on that, specifically when we're thinking about signposting children in terms of who they should be going to for help and support in school. And I'd be interested to hear your views on that.
Thank you. I think it's a really interesting proposition to consider. In listening to both you and Nicola Dickey, it strikes me that while the priority here is the time frame for delivering counselling, and we do welcome that, I repeat that, there is a role here for guidance staff. And I think we require more consideration of resource and in training in how we work that way. We are part of a team. And even if there is dedicated counselling provision in school, and I work in an environment where there is, the guidance staff are often the conduit of information between the family learning that we identified and the day-to-day support. The complexity of mental health problems that are presented in school see daily contact with key individuals and support staff within guidance teams. So there is a recognition of the role that we play. I think too that in terms of inappropriate CAMHS referrals and provision, that means there is no need for a CAMHS referral to actually come through and be seen through to fruition, creates a burden of expectation upon guidance staff that we are not always able to deliver on. So to speak to my own experience, I have a degree in English and French literature and institutions. I can talk to you about the French political system, but I haven't had any recognised guidance certification. In my own time and at my own expense, I've undertaken the master's course provided as a distant learning basis from Aberdeen University, but the provision does not exist in terms of training or resource to really upskill the staff who are dedicated professionals and who want to improve learner outcomes, but simply do not have the means or access to the things they require to do so. Thank you.
Laura Meikle.
Thank you. I think what Deborah said is very relevant. The question began by talking about the review of personal support and education, and my team are responsible for the implementation of that review also. In addition to the work on personal and social education, which is about making sure that we provide high quality learning for children and young people on a wide range of topics around personal and social education, including relationships, mental health and wellbeing, and support for young people's life skills effectively. As part of our programme for government commitment, we actually have two other elements to this work. One is that we will enhance support and professional learning materials for teachers on good mental health. There is a working group established called the Mental Health and Wellbeing Working Group for Schools. It's meeting this afternoon. They are drawing together work on training materials which we can bring together. There is a vast amount of information about a wide range of mental health and wellbeing topics, and it is not possible, we feel, for teaching staff to be able to sift through all of those and find the materials that they need in terms of their own professional learning in order supporting children and young people's learning about mental health and wellbeing, and also to understand all the policy and legislative requirements and the services that may be available nationally in order to support them to respond to meeting what may be a very wide range of children and young people's mental health needs. And the outcome of that work is that we will draw together training materials into one place and place that within Education Scotland's website. So that resource will certainly be available before September 2020. We are expecting it to become available next term. In addition to that, we have the ongoing commitment to offer mental health first aid training to every local authority in Scotland, and we have done that to every single local authority. And so there are a number of things around this commitment. We are focused, as you rightly say, on school counselling just now, but my responsibility is much wider than that in terms of setting school counselling within the broader whole school approach to mental health and wellbeing. That's another piece of work that we're taking forward and has been discussed this afternoon. To set that within a wider context, but also to enable the linking of the services we're talking about today with the school nursing service and with the community services and with the other things that are available in schools. And so it's our job, we feel, to try and set that out for people so that they don't have to find their way through all of the stuff that's available, and to provide that within a framework. And so there is the work that we are doing, but we also work within an internal Scottish Government framework around drawing that's cross-government work all together as well, and that's a link to all of the work that we do with COSLA too.
I'm going to bring in Mr Johnson.
So I'm very interested in what people are discussing, and I'm just wondering if I can challenge a couple of the assumptions that seem to be here. And in doing that, I am very happy to be told that I'm wrong. I wonder if we're overdwelling on a particular understanding of mental health, and also using CAMS waiting times as a signal of success. I would wonder whether or not actually an increase in demand for CAMS might be, or other services might actually be a sign of success. And I say that because there are 20% of children that have a neurodevelopmental disorder. And at the moment, we are not diagnosing 1 in 5 children. And actually, what we need to be doing is making sure that that happens. So my question to people that have spoken so far are, you know, one is actually on that point, is we need to make sure that to my mind, that we are, the scope of what's being covered isn't just about anxiety and depression, it's about a much broader suite of issues and indeed underlying conditions. And that actually critically, that you know, there's the right connections, and that might lead to altered demand, so reduced demand for some things, but actually increased demand. I mean, I would like to see an increased demand for diagnosis for neurodevelopmental disorders. I mean, because critically, at the moment, I'm contacted by lots of people who to even get a referral would be a success. So I'd be interested in people's reactions to those thoughts. And can I just gently say, for some people, getting a prescription for a pill absolutely is a good outcome. So I would, if I can just gently say that, and I'll...
But it's getting the right people through to that referral
point people
process.
back to my own register of interest and diagnosis on that note as well. So I'd just be interested in people's reaction to those sets of points.
When I answered Ms Mackay, I think we don't see a correlation necessarily between the two. It's a bit of a cop-out to say it's complicated, but that's where we are. We have an awful lot of things going on in this space. Again, the Mental Health Task Force or the Programme Board are specifically looking at CAMS in more detail. There are lots and lots of things going on there. So I think if you look at the principles that we sought to agree, we are absolutely clear that there is no direct correlation between the two. And someone kind of asked about what will the referral process look? Will counsellors refer directly? Will that still go through guidance teachers? That will be determined locally on the basis of what is determined as the best thing for those children and young people. But that can only work if we can get the other parts of the system, so where we know we have these issues, working in a way that works for those local communities. So that's why we deliberately have not stipulated in any of the stuff that we issued from a kind of national level that a referral will come through a particular route and it'll have to have, you know, three degrees of separation and all this stuff. We just haven't done that because at the end of the day it will be up to our children and young people and the family supporting those children and young people to determine what is the best way we move forward with it. So I think if we're given any impression that we see a direct correlation that, you know, counselling will go up and CAMS will go down, that's certainly not the way in which COSLA are approaching that. If only it were that simple in some respects.
Ms Gallagher, you wanted to come in?
Just to come in on points made earlier by Ms Meikle, I welcome the resource put in place for guidance professionals, and you made links to the PSE review as well. In my short tenure within the working group, I know there was a concern about the delivery of PSE across Scotland. As a teacher in a range of institutions, I've noticed that quite often personal social education is a secondary consideration in creating curricula. So you dedicate your teaching staff to subject specialisms, and the people who teach PSE are not qualified professionals. The quality, therefore, of the learning and teaching delivered depends on the volition of the practitioner, how much they're invested in what they teach. And therefore, I do think Education Scotland is a valuable asset in terms of a national platform for gathering resources. But I do express concern about how it's accessed, how we guarantee that quality. And I hope that beyond PSE, there would be training resources for the mental health, for people working, the professionals working on a daily basis to support mental health issues. Not all of them diagnose neurodevelopmental issues, but school refusing, ongoing anxiety, and all the other issues we face on a daily basis. Thank you.
Yeah. Miss Beagle.
I'll
Yeah,
do really
I'm
quickly.
conscious.
I'll
I
go
now
really
have a list of about 7 people that all want to come in with supplementaries, but Miss Beagle,
Sorry,
yeah,
I'm very sorry.
It's fine.
So the PSE review absolutely echoed everything that you said in terms of the standing of personal social education within the curriculum, and we have a programme of work underway to respond to the recommendations of that review. That is due to be delivered before the end of the parliamentary term, and so we have a number of strands of work. There's the PSE work, there is the work around the mental health and wellbeing group around whole school approaches, but also around training and resources, which will provide a package of support to support those who are working with children and young people. So I suppose I recognise what you're saying. I didn't mean to imply that all those things were, were joined up in a big lump of work. That there are a number of strands which will all come to bear together in order to provide that support, coming at it from a number of different routes. It's how many different ways can we provide support across services, but also for school staff who are not intended to be the answer to all of these issues. It's about engagement of other services. How do you know who to engage? And I'll stop.
I'm just very conscious of a long list of people, so the committee members who haven't had a chance to get in here, but I will endeavour to get through them all. So I'm going to ask Ms Gibson to speak, and then we'll go to Dr Allen.
I just wanted to pick up on what had been said in terms of referral to CAMHS. I think that what we're seeing is a spectrum of issues in terms of referral to counselling. I think that the move by the Scottish Government to put counsellors in all school is incredibly positive in terms of promoting good mental health. So I think that's a slightly different slant to it than looking at it being very issue-based. I think it also normalises counselling as a service, which I think is incredibly important, not just for children and young people, but as those children and young people grow up and have issues in their lives. We see counselling in schools as being partly early intervention. You might have children who have low-level issues, and if you intervene at this stage through school counselling, those issues will not develop into something much greater. And I think that that's really important. Our work is very much solution-focused counselling. We're in there to help the young person come up with solutions to move forward in their life. We're not just there in a passive way to sit and listen to issues. It's very much an active role to enable the young person to come up with their own solutions and move forward. Dr Allen.
Thanks very much. I don't want Laura to feel like she's giving evidence in the traditional session in committee here. So I suppose it's a question based on something she said, but it's based on a question that's for everyone in the room, really, I suppose. And it was that, Laura, you mentioned, understandably, that the focus just now is on constructing this service and finding the people, and that you would be looking at a later date down the line. And not to put words in your mouth, I think you said you'd be looking at a later date down the line to look at what a successful outcome would be. I suppose my question is, should we at the same time, during the construction phase, be looking at that question so that we don't construct something that doesn't have a successful outcome?
Yes, so the information that we've sought from local authorities as part of our evaluation of the plan, it specifically asks about what are the outcomes you will use to measure your service. That will help us to build a consistent national picture around different outcome measures, which we will then be able to report upon. I think we are looking to, so the research that I looked at in terms of the Welsh model and the English model, which have already been in place for a number of years, looked at attendance, it looked at whether or not children and young people were feeling better. And I think that's probably the space that we want to get into. The service that I am aware of most closely, there's one local authority in Scotland which has had services in place for quite a long time. I have had sight of their evaluation of their outcomes, and so there is a model there which we will then build from nationally. In terms of timescale, I would have thought we might be talking in the next couple of years about us looking at the review then, so that we don't wait until it's too far along. As Nicola had said, if we need to adjust, we need to adjust, and we'll do so.
Hi, sorry. Do you want to come in this?
It was just to say that the guidance that we issued from Scottish Government to local authorities is absolutely clear that they should be considering evaluation. So I think local authorities are already in that space. It's a tried and tested model again in our schools. We don't do things in schools without checking back that they're going well.
Yeah, just you were talking earlier, and I understand everything you were saying about the pathways and referral and things. I just wanted to establish that it's important that families have got a clear pathway to get a diagnosis. I mean, one of my constituents was trying to get a diagnosis for autism, and my office had 5 different phone numbers. That was my office, and people are confused about how they actually get there. So I assume that that's part of your whole strategy.
Yeah, and that's work that's being specifically taken forward through the Mental Health Programme Board. So that's stuff that was already in train, and school counselling will go alongside that. But ultimately, we can't fix the referral routes from the school out. We need to be doing it kind of both sides. So absolutely, it's something that we are.
Thanks.
Thank you. Ms Smith.
Just ask Ms Gibson, you were very interesting about the training that's required. Could I ask you about the 170 hours that you were mentioning? Is the expectation that people do that as one unit, or is that something that they might do on a part-time basis, so it might take quite a long time?
No, we would hope that they would get their 170 hours of practice in as part of their qualification. They wouldn't get their qualification, and therefore they couldn't become a member of COSCA or BSAP until they'd completed their
So if somebody's starting out, you rightly said that the key sort of emphasis has to be on ensuring that we've got the right training and good quality training. So if somebody's coming into the system to be trained, how long would you expect the process to take before they are well qualified and able to do the job?
So in our organisation, our qualification, we would expect to take 2 years. But we heavily support our counsellors, our trainee counsellors as they're going through. So they will be our training team provide the supervision, for example.
Right.
So there's a really strong link between actually delivery of counselling and supervision and training. It's all tied together. But we would expect 2 years. Plus, they would maybe take 6 months to do their COSCA certificate pre-starting the diploma.
So if it does take 2 years, I mean, that's obviously quite a long period of time. How many people do you believe are in the training process now?
We have about 40 trainee counsellors going through at the moment. We are hoping to start another diploma in April because of the demand, and that'll take them 2 years. But the issue is if you're specifically training up children and young people's counsellors, they can't get the experience in a school environment until they've got their membership.
Right.
So I think that the route that we might take is that we might look at them seeing adults to get their placement qualification,
right.
Their 170 hours of placement as such
right.
within our organisation, and then we would give them their specialism, their children and young people's specialism
right.
on top of that.
So how long would they be in a school to get on the job experience?
We wouldn't put them out in a school until that we were absolutely happy that they were going to be able to work in a school, and they would probably start with 1 day a week, but they would
right.
be qualified by that time.
Right.
So they would have 170 hours of counselling with somebody, and then before that would have happened.
That's very helpful. Could I just ask any other panel members about this training process, just how long it takes? I think Ms Gallagher, you mentioned some concerns about the qualitative situation as well. Could you just say what you think we need to do to ensure we've got enough people fully trained?
I think my concern, not being a counselling professional, my concern was the popular adage about not working with children or animals. Teachers are a very funny bunch of people, and it's a very specific environment to work in, So, therefore, I take Stella's point. I can see that the way to get 170 hours of supervision may have to be done with adults, but how does that translate into an environment when you're working with children and young people? It goes back, my concern is, as I said earlier, the existing issue with recruitment and retention of teachers. How do we be in a situation where that same problem is not replicated in the counselling provision we're attempting to deliver?
Right. Sorry, yes.
No, can I add a few wee things? So I think absolutely what you've said and what's kind of echoing what Stella says. It's not easy working with children and young people, you know, as a counsellor. I think there probably are a lot of counsellors who are, you know, more than capable working with adults, but children's it's a different ball game. It's very different. I mean, I've been working with children now for 13 years. It's a long time. Specifically counselling, not as long. But I think, I mean, I've been training for 4 years, longer than 4 years now. So I'd imagine it would take a long time to be experienced and have the, you know, ability to go in and counsel.
Just to be clear, do you feel that the training for working with children and young people is more extensive or requires to be more extensive than it does for adults?
Yeah, I would say so.
And can I just ask, on what basis, what will you be doing extra when it comes to children and young people?
I think for me, I started my journey, you know, as Stella saying about COSCA, and then moving into specifically cognitive behavioural therapy. And it wasn't until I moved to the Spark that I specialised with children and young people. So I did have a foundation of being able to work with adults specifically, but I think the depth that the kind of training that the Spark has given me has provided me the ability to be able to, I suppose, provide really quality and integrative work. It's not just about specifically, you know, one modality suits. It's you know, depends what the child's needs are. Are you the best person for that child? You know, is it counselling that they actually need? They're so complex. But I don't think it's as easy as just, if I'm really honest, I don't think it's just as easy as just, you know, giving somebody a specialty. I think it takes a specific type of person to work with children and young people and be effective. I think the key for me working in schools is the relationship. It's absolutely imperative. If the relationship's not there, and it's not going to work. It doesn't matter how skilled and how good you are. The relationship's key, I think.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to bring in Miss Holmes and then Mr Valentine, and then we've got a supplementary for Mr Gray. So.
Yeah, just to follow on from your question, I mean, there's part-time routes and there's full-time routes. For myself, it took 4 years, and that was, and I'd already had 20 years experience of youth work, working with young children, young people. So it was a counselling skills qualification to begin with, then it was going on to a diploma in counselling, humanistic counselling, and then sort of building upon continuous CPD around trauma-informed work, you know, lots of work around safeguarding. And it really is, just to reiterate, it's about an absolute connection. It's almost like a combination of youth work skills and counselling and mental health weaving together, just so that you can go in and immediately strike a bond with a young person. And the very formal definition of counselling, where you're waiting for someone to speak and there's lots of silences and there's no sort of specific, you know, picking up on what Ms Gibson said around, you know, solution focused. It comes in, it's so integrative, so many skill sets, and it's continuous. You're learning all the time, and we learn from young people, you know, as well, and young people help shape our services, and that's really important as well.
Mr Valentine?
Yeah, just briefly to say that the issue of the length of time it takes to train new children and young people's counsellors is really key. You know, how can we get these people into the workplace quickly? Now, for those that do already have a diploma in counselling, so for example, many of our counsellors will have a diploma in relationship counselling, it would only be about another year of a top-up course that would enable them to get in, which is, I guess, part of what Relationship Scotland can bring to the table. We have, as I've said, many counsellors across all of the country who would be able to do with a year's course become qualified children and young people's counsellors within a relatively shorter period of time, as opposed to those who were starting from scratch. Can I very briefly just raise the point about the issue about ensuring that we do end up with fully qualified counsellors undertaking this work? The guidance for educational authorities is very helpful, but we do believe that there needs to be more work done on specifying what courses and what qualifications have to be done to ensure that only qualified people are undertaking this work. It is a complex area, it is confusing, but we certainly strongly welcome the involvement of COSCA and the other professional bodies to provide, hopefully, greater clarity for local authorities to ensure that only qualified children and young people's counsellors undertake this work.
Okay. Mr Gray?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of pull together some of the answers to Liz Smith's questions with some of the answers to the questions about numbers of counsellors earlier on. I mean, I think I wrote this down, and I think it's in the written evidence as well. But Laura, you said you had reassurance that we would have enough counsellors to deliver the commitment, which is a counsellor in every school by this autumn. But we heard that would need I don't know, the numbers are not clear, but if there's 160 registered counsellors just now, we need 360, that's another 200. We've just heard that it can take 1 year to top up in a qualified counsellor, 2 years to train a counsellor, 4 years if they're pursuing a part-time course. And earlier, I think Mr. Valentine said that they could, with an effort, maybe convert 40 of their existing qualified counsellors, but that would take 2 years. I just don't understand where your reassurance comes from, and I wonder if you could kind of explain why you're confident that we will be able to get enough.
That's okay. So the reference, I think, to the 160 is to the COSCA membership, but there's a second membership organisation in Scotland, which is BACP, and there was a workforce survey undertaken, and the reassurance comes from both of those things together. Joanna, I don't know if you want to...
So we have members that, you know, might not be in full-time employment, that work in private practice at the moment, that are qualified counsellors, that may have specialisms in, well, 40% of which have specialisms in working with young people. So there's a workforce there. It's just quite right. It may move from you know, providing different services. So that there's more guaranteed
so how
work.
many members do you have, sorry?
We have 2,300 members in Scotland, and COSCA also have, you know, a large membership as well. So we've got qualified counsellors, some of whom don't always work. They may work voluntary hours, there may be a combination. So the workforce is there, but it may need a little bit of added extra CPD. There's different routes for working towards our children and young people competency framework, and some of that can be in-house within services, so you can have a top-up within services. You know, there's different ways of being able to work with those young people if they're the right person for the job. I mean, that's what we were looking at earlier. So they still would have to go through a rigorous recruitment and selection procedure. I mean, for a service that I worked in Middle England, for we would interview a counsellor, and they would have to do a 45-minute video recorded session with a young person to be able to pass. You would need to look at whether they can work with young people.
But when you say top-up, is that the same kind of process that Stuart was referring to? That was a year you said that would take.
But there could be in-house service things. So you get a qualified counsellor, they go to work perhaps at your organisation, and there's things within your organisation that you can provide in-house to get them up to speed.
But they're not in a school. They can't be an in-school counsellor until they've
had that
completed
top-up.
the top-up.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I, sorry Alison, I'm going to totally abuse my position and ask a supplementary, and it's something in relation to something Dee said, which was for the model that's been given, it's almost like a one counsellor per school model, but Dee mentioned that, you know, part of the role of a professional counsellor is to decide if they're the right person to give that response. So how will this model accommodate it, you know, and give that flexibility where someone in a school feels that they're not the best person able to counsel a child?
So the intent is that the fundamental principle of school counselling is that the person has to wish to undertake that. We cannot compel young people to undertake counselling if they do not wish to. And so there are two parts. One is that the young person may say they don't want to engage, in which case what we are asking for as part of our arrangements are that there is engagement with other services in order to support that young person, so that we aren't in a position where there is no support provided at all. And again, that could be from a school nurse or from a community-based service or any of the other services which are already providing support in schools around mental health and wellbeing. There are a lot of work already underway here. Secondly, though, if there is a situation where there is an issue about a particular person in a relationship, we have asked for there to be a manager of the services in each of the local authorities in order to be able to manage if there's a significant incident and there is a need to prioritise counselling services in a particular school or a particular area, to be able to do that, but it would also be able to manage situations like that where there's a need to engage someone with someone else.
Okay. Ms Harris, can I bring in?
Yeah, no, Convener, thank you. No, I just think rather late to the table, but I really have to declare an interest because I'm actually the Finance Director of Relationships Scotland, Couple Counselling Central Scotland. I think that's its appropriate title. And I have to declare that they also provide counselling for schools across Central Scotland. They train and indeed provide supervision for these schools. So I just feel I was going to bring that in a lot earlier, but I never got the opportunity. My questions were really regarding appropriately qualified counsellors because I feel that is at the crux of the delivery of this service. And we've discussed quite a lot of that, I think, as the morning's progressed. And I just really want to, I believe this part, you're involved with primary schools, is that correct? So I really would like to expand, this service that the government are looking to roll out is for 350 counsellors to secondary schools. And I know that certainly in the experience I've had personally with Relationships Scotland, it's in secondary schools that counselling comes from. So I would like to ask everyone's opinion. Do you think there's a difference that's applied, between counselling for secondary schools? Does that affect how we're going to get 350 counsellors here for September 2020, as opposed to primary school counsellors? Do you think?
Methodologies that they might use within different settings, but I think the processes of working with schools and setting up service level agreements and knowing what the school environment is very similar.
I meant more the sort of like the counsellor skills as opposed to
we have a competency framework that goes from age 4 to 18, and there's a skill set within there. So when you're training to be a CYP counsellor, you can be looking at developing skills in all of those areas. So you might have some people that particularly specialise in working with the younger age range because they use a little bit more like play in their practice compared to older counsellors that work with older young people. But it's a similar skill set. I mean, I think it would be cross-transferable with if that's the direction of travel for a particular agency to go in. I mean, I don't know what you've got to add to that.
Well, D works in both secondary schools and primary schools. Our counsellors are trained in a way that they're trained to work with children and young people. We don't tend to work one-to-one with children under 8 unless there's a specific need. And a head teacher told me recently that she specifically wanted one of her 5-year-old pupils to access counselling, and that child was a refugee and couldn't engage in a group scenario at all. So we do therapeutic group work as well as with small groups, but that child wasn't able to even engage in group. So she felt one-to-one was more appropriate. In terms of training, our diploma in relational counselling is at level 11, so it's at master's level. And we also encourage our existing counsellors to undertake that. So Dee, for example, came into our organisation with a CBT as a qualified CBT counsellor, and she's now undertaking the diploma in relational counselling. And I'm not going to speak for her, but she would be able to explain the difference that makes to her practice. As an organisation, in terms of both training and delivering counselling services in schools and for adults, we've got a vested interest to make sure our counsellors are good quality counsellors. We are selling services to schools. We're providing counselling services to adults. We need to make sure this is our reputation that's at stake here. So we need to make sure that the people who are going out to schools for counselling adults are suitably qualified, and we would not put anybody out into a school or to deliver any counselling unless that we were absolutely happy that they were the right people delivering the right service.
Ms Harris, did you want to come?
No, I think a lot of my questions have been covered earlier on. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr Greer?
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to look a little bit at the funding model, and particularly how that relates to level of demand and how it relates to services that are not provided directly by counsellors employed by the local authority but by other providers contracted by them. So the funding model is a flat sum per school. additional money per head of pupil, and then additional money based on a rurality calculation around how many schools that there might be in an area. And I'd be interested in anyone's thoughts on whether that is a model that sufficiently captures the challenges of providing these services in large rural areas, but also other factors that we know correlate to demand for mental health services like deprivation. Does the funding model as currently laid out, will it effectively meet those demands across the country?
So yes, the funding model, yeah, we do. The funding model was established, as you said, so there's £45,000 for every local authority for a manager of that service, the reasons for which I've already stated, so we'll not cover that again. Then 7% of the total on the basis of rurality. That was because there were particular concerns about the infrastructure, potential infrastructure costs, for example, costs of travel of counsellors moving around schools, and then the rest on pupil numbers. The intent is to provide a service across the whole of Scotland, and the framework is there to do that. As Nicholas said earlier, there is then a level after that about what does the local service respond to in terms of need. We've worked on the basis that 10% of all pupils would be potentially a user of service when we were developing our model, and we haven't determined which of that 10%, where that 10% would come from in terms of that population. The 10% was reached because our evaluation of current services indicated that between 2.5% and 4.8% of pupils were using services, and because of the national approach to this, we then topped that up, given that we expect there to be more use of that service, and so we were at 10%. So I think the model is right. We recognise deprivation as one of the factors that may contribute, but there are also a number of other factors that may contribute, and rurality in terms of delivery was the concern for us. And therefore we have gone with that model.
And how quickly will you, I realise you've already discussed local authority level evaluation of success of the service, but looking at this as a national project, at what points will you evaluate this rollout of funding in particular, and how that relates to demand?
So we're in the first phase just now where we've drawn in plans. We will have a second drawing of information from authorities prior to September, and we will then look at the review of outcomes that we spoke about, but I would think that will be 24 months after the September 2020 implementation to allow that to bed in. So there are at least three checkpoints. We will also, at the end of there's a financial year end in the middle of there as well, and we will look within that at that point as well. We've got a number of checkpoints along the way.
Mr Valentine, you wanted to go in?
Yeah, just to part of the cost, of course, in this training is either for the students themselves to meet the cost of the training, or for organisations. So within the Relationship Scotland network, our services across the country would be keen to train new counsellors, but of course there'd be a cost of going on that course. And one of the things we called for in our written evidence was a centrally held fund to help provide training for organisations like us and others to either develop our own training. We currently do a lot of training courses for counsellors. We could develop a new course for children and young people's counselling, perhaps with ourselves or in partnership with others. But there is no fund, there's nowhere to go to with the way the fund is set up to apply for that level of resource. With all of the money being transferred to the local authorities and none of it being held centrally, that makes the task of just finding exactly who do you go to get support to develop the work we were able to do across the whole of Scotland. There isn't a fund that our organisation can apply to get that support.
Well, it's okay. So I think we recognise that as a one of the positions. I think, as I said earlier on, recognising the concern about whether or not we would have sufficient training available. We have worked with the SQA as a national body in order to enable that there is training available through colleges all across Scotland, and so from my perspective we have taken a mitigating action around that in order to relieve some of those concerns, but we've done that in a way which is strategic, I think. I don't know.
Yes, I suppose I would just like to add to that there is nothing to stop a collaborative of local authorities, in fact, putting forward some money to do training. At the moment, we do not know where we have gaps in provision. So, for example, some local authorities, as we know, are looking to grow their own or are looking to do other things. So those local authorities would not benefit from having some money taken off and put into a national pot. So I think, whilst we have gone down one route, there are a number of reasons that we've done that. Speed being one of them, to be quite honest, it's not unusual for COSLA and Scottish Government to spend significant amounts of time talking about how we distribute money. We are where we are, but I don't necessarily see what you're suggesting there as something that might not be there in the future. The other thing is that in thinking about things in a truly strategic fashion, we have employability services, we have fair funding directorates, we have lots of other things that don't necessarily sit in and around school counselling that we would be looking to reach out to, because that's what we're doing in other portfolios. That's what we're doing around about early learning and childcare expansion. That's what we're doing around about where we've got other shortages in workforce of a particular kind across Scotland. So whilst we are talking about school counselling, I do see our heads of education and their economic inclusive growth guys locally, if we get to that point where a local authority is saying we just don't have the availability, probably rural areas would be a good shout on that sort of stuff. So I don't think we've kind of knocked that stuff away. We've done it, removed it at a national level, but that doesn't stop regional arrangements or individual local authorities.
Okay, Mr Valentine.
A brief response. I think part of the issue, you're back to the whole issue of speed. How quickly can you get people trained up? If you look at Dumfries and Galloway, for example, their council are taking the grow your own approach, which is commendable, but they've recently advertised positions of stating that the people who are successful would begin doing the COSCA counselling skills course, the very first qualification of at least a 4-year process before they could call themselves a children and young people's counsellors. That will not deliver something quick enough to meet the requirements that we're trying to get.
Really starting from a blank sheet of paper. So I think that's the other thing that we're potentially talking in a situation where we don't actually know in terms of, until we get in and do that evaluation, we don't know whether Dumfries and Galloway may have to change their model, or another local authority might have thought about bringing it in-house and they might change their mind and commission it out the way. So I think that's the other thing, that there is enough flexibility there that if we need to tweak as we go, we will, for the benefit of our children and young people.
Mr Greer.
But if they're going to have to change that model, they're going to have to change it pretty soon, aren't they? If it's going to have an impact on what they can do in autumn this year.
In terms of the governance structure, we are actively working on collating that sort of stuff, and we will. The other stuff is as well that as we collate those models, we will do what we always do in local government, and that is make sure that those that are working, or those that look as if they've got the greatest chance of success, will be shared across the other local authorities so that they can learn from one another. So I think, yes, nobody's saying that the timescales are not tight.
Mr McGee, and I'll go back to Mr Greer.
Earlier about research, and I'd like to just quickly pick up on that in the evidence paper from the University of Glasgow that the committee had in front of them. There was reference to research, and the word scarcity and scarce was frequently included in that paper. I think the committee might be interested to know that there is a substantial piece of research about to be published in the spring of this year. It's called the Ethos Study. Its title is Effectiveness and Cost-Effectiveness of Humanistic Counselling in Schools. It's a random controlled trial study. It's one of the biggest that's ever been done in the counselling field. It's led by Professor Mick Cooper, who formerly was Professor of Counselling at the University of Strathclyde and now at Roehampton University, and a number of other universities are involved in that study. It's had 4 previous pilots which all indicate towards positive benefits coming from counselling in schools, and we're awaiting the final outcome results of that study in the spring. There will be a dissemination conference around those results as well, and committee might be interested in finding out what actually is being said as a result of that study.
Okay, Mr Greer.
I think the committee would certainly be interested in that. It'd be very valuable. Just like to go back to Ms Dickey and ask her around procurement. Some of the written submissions that we received for this expressed concerns, maybe not quite the right word, but they wanted to flag up what could potentially become a concern around organisations that can provide counselling services that wouldn't necessarily be able to tender for any contract that was offered on a local authority-wide basis, particularly with larger and geographically large local authorities. I realise procurement is something that each local authority does in its own right, sometimes through the regional collaboratives. It is also a massively complex area. But is there guidance being issued at COSLA or perhaps from the Scottish Government level around ensuring that some of these very, very high quality providers are still able to contribute towards this, even if they can't necessarily provide for a whole local authority area?
So as is the way normally with local government, we will make sure that we are sharing that type of intelligence. The other place that we would always go naturally for help with commissioning would be Scotland Excel. So they will be able to help issue. It would not be for COSLA to issue commissioning guidance. That would be way above my technical capabilities, I have to say. But certainly those conversations are ongoing. And again, many of the local authorities who may find that they have issues around about workforce, it would not be in their interests to lock people out or in of commissioning for services. So I don't see us being in a situation that's a significant issue.
We obviously, as a delivery agency, we're always on top of the procurement side of things, and we're starting to see contracts for counselling coming out. One local authority, which is a very large one, it was interesting, they came out first of all and asked for views as to whether they should put it out as a whole contract or whether it should be split up. Even as one of the leading providers in counselling, in children and young people's counselling in schools, we couldn't carry a massive contract. It would be too dangerous to us financially to pick up a large contract. So we're actually hoping that we see counselling contracts coming out, smaller ones coming out, so dividing up large local authorities. The only worry that I have with that is that if there are not sufficient children and young people's counsellors within that authority or accessible to that authority, that we're all going to be squabbling over the same counsellors. So if, for example, a contract got divided into 4, say, for example, Glasgow, which is a large authority, and they split it into 4 and we've got 4 providers, that we're all going to be chasing after the same counsellors. And that is a real concern for us. We're also seeing other local authorities approaching it from a cluster perspective, which is interesting. And we have also been in touch with one local authority who is looking at training because they recognise that they are not going to have enough counsellors, so they're going to look at a mixed delivery where they might train some and recruit others. So, you know, because we're working on the ground, we're watching this all the time, but certainly large contracts coming out. I'm not sure which counselling agencies across Scotland would be able to pick up and support a large contract.
Ms Fisher, yeah.
It's a different subject.
A different subject? Yeah, and unless anyone's got any comments. I'll let Mr Greer finish and then I'll come to you.
And hopefully this is very brief and either Ms Dicker or Ms Meeko will be able to answer it. Part of the guidance that's come out already said that if counselling services are already provided through pupil equity funding, then they could simply transfer over to this. It's a little bit challenging for us to scrutinise what's happening with PEF at national level, and I'd just be interested, are there a substantial number of schools or local authorities that are using PEF to provide counselling and related services?
We know that there are a number of health and wellbeing interventions being funded from PEF, and so we expect that will be a feature of some of this implementation. I think it's helpful that we're able to allow that to happen. We need to make sure that the aims and principles are still delivered as part of the arrangements for that. So we will have information from that as part of our governance arrangement, and so we will have an understanding of that.
Great, thanks. I'll probably follow that up in writing in that case.
Thank you. Ms Fisher.
Mr Greer has just asked what I was going to ask, so just had the answer. But could I also ask about if local authorities don't spend the full allocation in the current financial year, does the allocation get rolled over to the next?
So as I've said, we're in our governance arrangements at the moment, and I can't share with you where we are in terms of our understanding of that picture. We will have conversations as our usual in these situations if that is necessary to try to enable that to happen.
Is that a time scale and when that will be available? When have you got a timescale as to when you will be able to share that information?
So I am expecting to report to the next programme board, which is in April.
Ms Ross?
Yeah, just on the back of that, why was the decision made not to ring fence it?
The arrangement that we have is to provide the joint agreement, because it allows us to have the aims and principles, a financial arrangement, and a joint agreement with causal leaders, because that was the most effective way that we were able to do that. I think there may have been some concerns from COSLA if we had.
Yes, I think COSLA have a position around about the ring fencing of funds, and I think the ring fencing of funds would prevent the flexibility that we've just spoken about there, in terms of if we were to ring fence it for a very specific thing, we would be constrained in the way that we could actually respond locally. We are absolutely satisfied that the aims and the principles on the political agreement that we've got is exactly where we will go on this stuff. And on the point about whether we'll be carrying forward, local government in Scotland are looking to deliver on this commitment and deliver on the agreement that we have. So we are not yet at a situation where we're preparing not to spend the money in this financial year.
Mr Johnson.
Thank you. In some ways, my question follows neatly on from Ross Greer's about funding mechanisms and the model for that. At the beginning of the session, we heard from a number of contributors about that successful school counselling has a whole school approach, and a number of comments about the need to have the right supervisory model. So my question is, what does kind of good practice look like in terms of how this service integrates with the rest of the school? I mean, for example, I've got simple questions of, do counsellors report to head teachers, or are they reporting completely outside of the school? We've got in the written submissions some local authorities implementing a hub approach, whereas others absolutely, looking at assigning particular counsellors to particular schools. And while we don't want a uniform approach, these are quite fundamental differences, and fundamentally we don't want this something that happens to schools. We want this to be part of schools. So I'm just wondering, particularly from the practitioners, so, Jan Holmes and Stella Gibson, what does good practice look like to you while local authorities are developing their models?
I think from our experience, so we provide a school counselling service, and we would provide the management for that school counselling service. And we would have a service level agreement set up with the head teacher. In a primary school, it would be the head teacher. In a secondary school, it would probably be pastoral care that we would be engaging with. The counsellor in the school would be working with, in high schools, it would be pastoral care. In primary schools, it would be working to the deputy head or the head teacher in terms of referral processes. So that would be that would be how it would be managed. If there's any issues with the service delivery, those issues would come to the organisation and the manager within the organisation. If there's any clinical issues, that would come through to our clinical team. So we've got a whole team of senior clinicians within the Spark who provide support to the counsellors in schools. The counsellors are not employed by the school. The counsellors in our service are employed by the Spark. It will really come down to how each local authority decides to procure that. If they're procuring a delivery agency like ourselves, then we would still manage the counsellors.
Yeah.
And we would have an agreement with the schools. If, for example, and this does happen, that you put a counsellor into a school and that relationship doesn't work in the school.
Yeah.
So, the relationship in a primary school with the head teacher just doesn't work well. We would be able to put another counsellor in that school, and that's the benefit of having an agency to do it. But we would work with the school to ensure that there's a good relationship there. I mean, that's what it all comes down to, is relationships. And that if there are any issues on the ground that either would come through clinical or would come through the management of the service. But it will come down to what the local authorities decide to do.
No, that's helpful. General Holmes, in particular, I was interested by your comments about need for a whole school approach. I mean, what are the elements of that?
Good practice is it's integrated is the counselling service, but it's separate as well. So it's got its boundaries for its own sort of professional provision of counselling. And with that, I mean that the counsellor isn't everywhere in the school. The counsellor is, the counsellor has a room, and the teachers and pastoral staff are not bringing young people constantly to the counsellor who might be having panic attacks, who might be having meltdowns. It might be teachers that want to ask advice. That can't be in place. That there has to be a time for that. So you could provide a drop-in. There's some counsellors will provide a drop-in service where it's more open access, so that when the counsellor is with the young person, there's going to be no interruptions. They've got a room established. There's a referral pathway. The young person knows how to contact the counsellor. The counsellor has things in place so that if a session is going to be cancelled, it's not cancelled last minute, so that you're not arriving at a school and there's just absolutely no communication. So having a link person in school is a really important, and it could be a pastoral worker, it could be a head teacher in primary school, but there's constant communication there.
So do you have any concern? I mean, because what you're describing there is a situation where you need to get that integration with the rest of the school really right, which is about the teachers, and there'll be particular issues at that school. I mean, do you have any concerns about kind of a relatively, certainly at a local authority level, centralised approach to finding and delivering those, rather than a school by school based approach? I mean, are there any concerns that you have there?
I think some good practice approaches are that when a counsellor is assigned to a school, that they initially go into assemblies, so year assemblies, and introduce themselves and talk about referral processes. This is my face, this is who I am, this is how you can get in contact with me. It doesn't have to come from a teacher, it can come from you, and that's confidential. So there's a lot of work that's done around confidentiality and safeguarding. And when you're not working as an individual practitioner in a school and you have the strength of a service behind you with all those policies, it's a real added value. So my concerns sometimes for poorer practice is when you're working in a school, you're situated there permanently all the time, but you haven't got the professional boundaries in place to keep the practice as pure as possible, really, so that you're not seen talking to teachers or the head teacher, because young people worry about confidentiality. They really worry about the relationship that they have with you is unique, and that is in that room, and the only things that are passed on are the things that you agree to pass on. So you just have to keep that professional boundary with for yourself, and that's sometimes so hard to do when you're situated in a school, because there's so many dual relationships, and it's the dual relationships that can affect the delivery of the service.
Okay, that's useful. And finally, I mean,
just before Ms. Gibson wanted to come in on that point as well, Daniel, sorry.
We're not talking about just parachuting counsellors into school. I don't think that would work. And I also think that schools are incredibly complex places to work. And we've spent 3 years developing the service that we've got. This isn't something that just happens overnight. I suppose a concern for me would be that there are organisations who think, all right, well, we could deliver school counselling now. We've got adult counsellors. We don't have any experience of delivering a school counselling service, but we've got adult counsellors who could train to be children and young people's counsellors, and we could put them into a school and we could get a contract. It's taken us 3 years of hard work to get this absolutely to the point that we've got it. I'm not saying that we've got it 100% right, but we have a quality service there. And it is about, as you say, Joanna, it's about the structure, it's about the policies, it's about the boundaries, it's about the relationships that are all there. It's not just a case of, right, okay, we have to provide 30 counsellors in Glasgow. We'll just drop counsellors into schools. That just wouldn't work at all. And the local authority has to be comfortable that they're going to get a quality service.
Yeah. Ms. Barker-Craigan?
I think just to add to that really quick, I've done both. I've worked out with an organisation counselling and with also the Spark, and I think just what Joanna was saying around having being in school with a clinical team, a manager, and it's very structured in terms of who you would contact, who your contact, who your link person would be. You're not alone, because the counsellor working in isolation is really difficult. So comparing the two, I think being held and supported by the Spark as a counsellor is something that I think counsellor needs. I think working in isolation or working either, you know, self-employed or just being put in there without, you know, a network of support, I think would be quite detrimental to the well-being of, you know, that counsellor as well.
No, that's good. Yeah.
You go. I suppose that some of the stuff that we're starting to stray into in terms of boundaries, supervision, is in the guidance that was issued to local authorities from Scottish Government. So I think we are under no illusions around about what we should be doing at a local area, at a local authority level. We would not be doing anything to a school, least not because all of the situations that we have set up in our secondary schools are very different. The way in which all schools are approaching pastoral staff, for example, the way in which some schools already have drop-ins for other bits and pieces. We would not be in a situation where we were imposing that, but we were absolutely clear when we put that guidance out that there should be boundaries and our young people should be able to understand the difference between having a conversation with a teacher and having a conversation with a counsellor. So at a local level, we know what we're setting out to achieve, but that model would be in partnership with our schools.
Yeah, Ms Gallagher.
Thing about partnership, I think that is very much the spirit in which counselling works at the moment, and good practice, to go back to your question, extends to very, very simple things like, as we said in our submission form, in conversation with team around the child, professionals or counsellors and extended support staff. It allows guidance professionals to be responsive to issues raised. So for instance, if you see a culture of self-harming arising in a group, you can adapt things like personal social education and be responsive to those things. So good practice goes way beyond triaging, referral systems and so on. Every kind of partnership working with the support team in the school should lead directly to improved outcomes for our young people.
Okay, I'm going to move on to Ms Goldruth.
I'm interested in something that we touched upon with Daniel Johnson's line of questioning regarding the ethics of confidentiality and how information is shared in schools. And at the moment, my understanding is if I was still in a school that, you know, information would be shared quite readily between guidance staff and frontline teachers because we were trusted with that information and also to give us an understanding and an awareness of the pupils in front of us. And I think in particular, in my experience, if I was teaching a modern studies lesson, for example, and somebody in that class perhaps was living in a household or had experienced watching domestic abuse or had been in that environment, and I was teaching a lesson perhaps about new legislation on that very topic, I would want to have an understanding about what that pupil was going through before I addressed that subject, if indeed I maybe perhaps changed the focus of my lesson entirely because I knew actually there was somebody in the room who had experienced it. And I'm interested in the ethics then of confidentiality and how that's shared with teaching staff, and particularly from the professionals' perspective here who are maybe not teaching staff in a school, and how that would be communicated to me as a classroom teacher, or would it just not be because of that confidentiality?
I would suggest that David could answer this probably more clearly, that it wouldn't be shared with you because it is confidential.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think the only it's difficult, but I think confidentiality, I think, is part of, you know, building that therapeutic relationship and knowing that that young person, you know, can trust you. The only thing that I would ever share would be risk, or if, you know, and it would be to pastoral care. I very much doubt, I've never kind of came across counsellors or myself sharing information with teachers like that.
Can I just add that unless the young person is specifically asked that, and you're working in their best interest, that wouldn't it be quite handy if your teacher knew this? Yeah. And so quite often the counsellor might pick up on things that actually can really help in the classroom situation, and through a process of negotiation and working with the young person, you decide to approach the classroom teacher because actually this person has been really horrible to that young person for so long, and they sit really closely together, and it would help if they sat there. Lots of little things like that. So some really low sort of what don't seem to be big issues but are really big for the young person. But around confidentiality, you know, confidentiality has its limits, and of course it is around significant harm. But for some services, and for services that I worked with within England, we had a policy within our service that we had to disclose, you know, to the lead designated safeguarding lead if there's a disclosure of self-harm. You know, so there are limits to confidentiality, and you explain that with the young person. you know, right at the beginning when you're contracting. So for every counselling relationship, there is a contract that is put in place with that young person, so they explicitly understand what the limits and parameters of confidentiality are. So we don't hold on to everything. We certainly don't. And because when we're working for services, we take that back. We discuss that with our supervisor, the supervisor that was quite rightly part of that organisation. This has come up. Where do you think I should go with this? You know, so you're not holding things. You're not making that decision to keep information. You're processing that in the best interest of the child. And if the best interest of the child is to share some information, you go back to that young person, you say, I think what we really could do with, I know we said this last week, but what we could really do with is perhaps looking to sharing that with your, you know, head of year. And you work with that young person to do that, because it's about keeping the young person safe from harm. Yeah.
Yes, Ms Bickle, you wanted in.
So I suppose, in the development of all of this and in all of our conversations, sharing of information and safeguarding and confidentiality were raised again and again and again. And as a consequence of all of those discussions, within the aims and principles which are jointly agreed in part of our framework agreement between local authority with the Scottish Government and COSLA, one of the principles is that local policies and procedures in relation to child protection and information sharing should be followed. The requirements of the registering body, for example, in terms of professional conduct and supervision, should also be followed. And that allows us to reflect the moral responsibilities and conducts that we talked about earlier on, but also safeguarding and information sharing confidentiality and keeping children and young people safe, whilst also respecting the confidentiality where it's required of the one-to-one conversation between the young person and their counsellor.
Yeah, Mr McGee.
And also built into that guidance was reference to when things go wrong and for there to be a clear, accessible complaints procedure for the children and young people to use, and that's a very important aspect as well.
Dr Allen, you want to...
Thanks very much. It was just on the point that was made there about confidentiality, and I suppose I'm thinking here of smaller communities, representing a smaller community, but this point doesn't just apply to smaller communities. While you may well, and I'm sure you would, reach a situation where there was very strong confidence in the school community about confidentiality, particularly, again, thinking of a smaller community, the fact that someone has visited or had a meeting with a counsellor or gone through the counsellor's door is going to be a matter of public record. And in many communities, not just a matter of public record in the school, but well out with it. So how do you deal with some of those sensitivities? And also, how do you deal with situations where potentially a parent who gets to hear about this might try to exercise some kind of veto on their child contacting a counsellor when they may have very good reason to contact a counsellor?
In terms of children's rights, if a child understands what counselling is, then they have access to counselling and the confidentiality that comes with it that adults have. So it's not, parents you mentioned is another whole consideration here about what involvement parents and others in the children's life have in terms of the access to counselling. But in terms of the right to confidentiality, it's the same as that of adults, as long as they understand what counselling is.
Yeah, but I'm not talking about confidentiality in the room. I'm talking about the fact that it will become a matter of public record that they have gone through your door. Because everyone will have seen them go through your door. I'm asking how you deal with that situation.
It also could be how you code it. So in the school that I worked in, if there was a counselling appointment or a young person had a counselling session, it could either be with myself or it could be an outside agency coming in. We would code that on our SIMS register as an appointment. So it doesn't come up on the register that it's counselling. It's kept as really tight as possible. We called a lot of things mentoring in this particular school. So it was recorded that way. So not every single teacher is aware of why it is that somebody is going out of a lesson. And it's quite traditional in a lot of schools that people do come out of a lesson. They might come out of a lesson to see a nurse. It might be it could be any particular appointment. So it's not public knowledge. The room is really, really important where the service is provided. And if it's only known as the counselling room, there can be some stigma that goes with that. So schools have to think about, in partnership with the provider who's providing that counselling, how it's going to look in the school, where it's going to be, how young people access access that. When they come out of a lesson, if the session time almost has to be at the same time as a lesson, but where do they go after that? What if they're distressed afterwards? What processes and procedures do you have in place, you know, where you can have a little bit of time just to sort of rebalance yourself, because, you know, lots of discussed in counselling that can be really, you know, upsetting, and sometimes you become more upset to begin with than, you know, where you end up at the end of counselling. So there's lots of sort of conditions that need to be looked at with great sensitivity. So individual schools would need to consider how to best manage that.
Ms Gallagher?
These are not trite considerations at all, and the logistical issues associated with what you're talking about, Joanna, are very, very real ones. Again, in our specific questions, we asked about accommodation for counsellors within secondary schools. That's not just about pressures and resource in terms of spaces and so on. It is about protecting that confidentiality you refer to, because there is a big difference between very regular leaving of classroom to go to, say, a music lesson or to get a plaster for a paper cut. If you go to the counselling room, it does immediately expose you as someone who's getting that level of help. And in my experience, even pupils who self-refer for counselling and therefore are committed to the process and are seeking that help do immediately ask questions about safeguarding confidentiality. It is something they're hypersensitive to. So this is where planning jointly with school staff and liaison has a really big impact, because also another issue you raised, Joanna, I found interesting was the after. So if we provide, say, one period of support for a pupil, dedicated weekly support, and thereafter they find themselves in a position of distress, who's available to them? Pastoral staff in schools, professionals like myself, have dedicated and often quite extensive teaching commitments. Do they find themselves going to an area? In my own school, we've resourced a wellbeing base this year. It's not always staffed. The pressure to fulfil teaching commitments and be available to different people at different times means that there's not always that level of support. Again, if it falls upon guidance staff to provide this, we could do with more input, training and commitment from school leaders to make ourselves available to the kinds of things young people will need. If I could pick up on a confidentiality thing briefly as well, Jenny made an interesting point about sharing information. And while, of course, safeguarding legislation covers a great deal of what we do, if there is the relationship and collaboration between guidance professionals and counsellors, there are opportunities to do things like think that someone is receiving support. We don't want to breach confidentiality, but if you know that the Holocaust is going to be covered in a history lesson and this person is a survivor of some kind of genocide, perhaps you have scope to sidestep the hurt caused. It's not a safeguarding issue per se or around confidentiality, but with in speaking to the young person about potential outcome, you can sidestep some of the difficulties and avoid that distress. I think that's what you were alluding to, Jenny, but that has all to be done with consent given from young people. We follow the same policies and procedures to ensure that we're not overstepping boundaries and so on, but it just points to the interesting and quite complex points of liaison between school staff and counsellors.
Ms Meikle.
Just very briefly, the guidance that we've provided to authorities to inform their planning is clear about where counselling services should take place, and asks for authorities to consider the location of the room, particularly so that young people are able to access that room where their peers or other persons so that they're not able to be seen entering, leaving or waiting to be seen. So the guidance also reflects those concerns, again fed back from small communities, that there would be unintended identification.
Okay, I'm very conscious of time. Ms Gibson, I'm conscious I promised I would come back to you. Is there anything you feel that you haven't been able to say that you wanted to?
I think that there's just one other point about the availability of counsellors, and I know this is about children and young people's counselling, but there's obviously a whole lot of counsellors who are going to go into further education and universities. And when I read through all the papers, it became clear that the funding that was available for universities was actually at a much higher level than the funding that was available for schools. And we're already seeing universities advertising for counsellors at much higher salaries than we will ever be able to pay. So does that mean that the universities are going to recruit all the best counsellors and children and young people in schools are going to be left with the poor relations?
Sticky.
That Laura and I are involved in the work that's going on in colleges and universities, somewhat selfishly, to make sure that they are aware of some of our issues. We have also encouraged our universities and colleges to have conversations with their local authorities where they are situated, so that we're not in a situation where we are potentially displacing people from one place to another. How much success we will have with that will really depend on how we go, but it's certainly something that Laura and I and our respective teams are live to. So it is an area that we are aware of.
Colleges tendering for counselling services, and it's not the full amount of money that was awarded to them for the counselling service that has been put in the tender. And they're asking for more counsellors than was awarded. And you've got organisations who are struggling to provide these services. And where does that leave the quality in all of this? You know, so you're looking for a lot more than was identified by the Scottish Government, but you're putting less money into it. It's quite an interesting situation at the moment, watching the environment.
Okay, does anyone else have anything pressing they wanted to say that I haven't had an opportunity to share? Yes, Ms Gallagher.
I just wanted to say something about the mode of delivery of counselling in schools. We've talked about local flexibility and different models of delivery, including group work. There was a suggestion in one of the briefing papers about digital platforms for counselling. And to pick up on a point made earlier by Ms Smith about skills for working with young people, I think fundamentally it's a principle of counselling, I know, but when you work with young people, you have to seek to engage them and develop alliance. And I just wanted to express concern that if digital platforms were considered to be a cost-effective solution, or indeed a way of reaching remote or small rural communities, I would express concern about the ability to build alliance with young people and really have the improved outcomes we'd be looking for in counselling.
Sorry, Joanne. Yes,
there's been quite a lot of evidence-based data that's been picked up from digital platform providers, particularly an organisation called ZenZone that operate. I think they do have some contacts in Scotland, but they work within a CYP framework. They are trained counsellors that specialise in working with children and young people, and that they deliver, and they have the supervision and the support, and they deliver, to rural areas, particularly in Wales, Norfolk in England, and they're able to, it evaluates quite well. It's not a replacement for face-to-face. It's an added offer, and some young people actually do prefer to go down the digital route because they find they're able to express things a lot quicker, particularly if it's asynchronous communication, so that they can type and get things off of their chest that way, and it accelerates. Some findings have found that it accelerates the actual process. It's an offer, but certainly not just the solution. Yeah.
Can I thank everyone for their attendance at committee this morning? It's been really informative, given us lots of food for thought. And please, if there's anything that you do feel that you want to elaborate on or assign to the committee, please send it in to the clerks and we'll take that on board. But thank you very much for the session. I'm going to suspend until 12:10, but remind members they're still coming into public session. Thank you very much.